Shadows of Stalingrad. In the frozen winter of 1942, the city of Stalingrad was a battleground like no other. The German army, led by the ruthless General Friedrich Paulus, had launched a brutal assault on the city, determined to capture it and crush the Soviet resistance. But as the war raged on, a sense of unease settled over the German troops. They had heard rumors of a mysterious figure, a Soviet soldier who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They called him the Vrag, the enemy, and whispered stories of his supernatural strength and agility. One soldier, a young German lieutenant named Hans, was skeptical of the rumors. He had seen the worst of war, and he didn't believe in ghost stories. But as he led his men through the ruins of Stalingrad, he began to feel a creeping sense of dread. It started with small things. Equipment would go missing, and strange noises could be heard in the night. Hans tried to tell himself it was just the wind or the creaking of old buildings, but deep down, he knew it was something more. One night, as he was patrolling the streets, Hans saw a figure in the distance. It was tall and imposing, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. Hans tried to raise his rifle, but his hands were frozen with fear. The figure began to move towards him, its eyes fixed on Hans with an unblinking stare. Hans tried to run, but his legs were rooted to the spot. The figure loomed closer, its presence filling the air with an unspeakable horror. And then, everything went black. When Hans came to, he was lying in a hospital bed, his head throbbing with pain. The doctor told him he had been found unconscious in the street, with no memory of how he got there. But Hans knew what he had seen. He knew that the Vrag was real, and that it was coming for him. As the days passed, Hans became increasingly unhinged. He would see the Vrag everywhere, lurking in the shadows and watching him with an unblinking gaze. He tried to tell his comrades, but they just thought he was shell-shocked. One night, Hans decided to take matters into his own hands. He snuck out of the hospital and made his way back to the front lines, determined to find the Vrag and put an end to the terror. As he moved through the ruins of Stalingrad, Hans felt a sense of unease growing inside him. He knew he was being watched, and he could feel the Vrag's presence all around him. And then, he saw it. The Vrag was standing in front of him, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly fury. Hans tried to raise his rifle, but it was too late. The Vrag reached out and touched his face, and Hans felt his mind shatter into 1,000 pieces. The next morning, the German troops found Hans's body, lying in the street with a look of unspeakable horror on his face. They never found out what happened to him, but they knew that the Vrag was still out there, waiting for its next victim. As the war raged on, the legend of the Vrag grew. Soldiers on both sides whispered stories of the supernatural soldier, and how it could strike at any moment. And though the war eventually ended, the terror of the Vrag never truly went away. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of Hans's screams, echoing through the ruins of Stalingrad. And if you're brave enough to venture into the city, you'll see the Vrag waiting for you, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fury. The Lost Battalion. In the midst of the Battle of Stalingrad, a group of German soldiers found themselves cut off from the rest of their unit. They were a battalion of about 500 men, led by a grizzled old captain named Müller. As they tried to make their way back to their lines, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. It was a massive building, with walls that seemed to stretch up to the sky and a roof that was partially collapsed. Müller decided to take shelter in the factory, hoping to wait out the battle and then make a break for it. But as they settled in, the soldiers began to feel a sense of unease. It started with small things. Doors would slam shut on their own, and strange noises could be heard in the night. The soldiers tried to tell themselves it was just the wind or the creaking of old wooden beams, but deep down, they knew it was something more. One night, as they were huddled around a fire, they heard a strange noise coming from the depths of the factory. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, and it was getting closer. The soldiers tried to shine their flashlights into the darkness, but the beam just seemed to disappear into the void. And then, they saw it. A figure, tall and imposing, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The figure began to move towards them, its eyes fixed on the soldiers with an unblinking stare. The soldiers tried to raise their rifles, but their hands were frozen with fear. One by one, the soldiers began to disappear. At first, the others thought they had just wandered off, but as the night wore on, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The last soldier to remain was a young private named Schmidt. He was hiding in a corner of the factory, his heart pounding with fear. And then, He saw the figure looming over him, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly fury. Schmidt tried to scream, but his voice was frozen in his throat. The figure reached out and touched his face, and Schmidt felt his mind shatter into 1,000 pieces. The next morning, the Soviet troops found the factory, abandoned and silent. They searched the building from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the German soldiers. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. But as they were leaving, they found a strange symbol etched into the wall. It was a crude drawing of a soldier, with eyes that seemed to stare into the soul. And below it, a single word was scrawled, Vrag. The Soviet troops knew that they had stumbled upon something sinister, something that went beyond the boundaries of war. They knew that the Vrag was real, and that it would haunt the battlefields of Stalingrad forever. The curse of the Vrag. As the war raged on, the legend of the Vrag grew. Soldiers on both sides whispered stories of the supernatural soldier, and how it could strike at any moment. And though the war eventually ended, the terror of the Vrag never truly went away. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of screams, echoing through the ruins of Stalingrad. And if you're brave enough to venture into the city, you'll see the Vrag waiting for you, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fury. The Vrag is a reminder that war is not just about bombs and bullets, but about the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows. It's a reminder that some terrors are beyond human comprehension, and that the horrors of war can never truly be forgotten. And so, the story of the Vrag lives on, a cautionary tale about the horrors of war and the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows. It's a story that will haunt you forever, a reminder that some terrors are beyond human comprehension,